Have you ever wondered what this NELA National Emergency Laparotomy Audit is all about? What data is being collected and what impact has this data had on patient care in the United Kingdom? Well, we know that emergency general surgery is by far the largest surgical subspecialty, and we also know that emergency laparotomies have a really high mortality. So they are at the same time the largest and the sickest group of patients that we encounter. And this high mortality issue with emergency laparotomies has been known about for almost 30 years. NCEPOD, who of course have been making qualitative reports about perioperative care since the late 1980s, have identified this issue. For example, this is just one clinical case from their 1993 report, which described a man in his late 70s who presented with a strangulated hernia, who was poorly resuscitated in renal failure, and who was anaesthetised by an associate specialist after just a litre of fluid resuscitation and no invasive monitoring. And in fact, the surgical case was managed by a registrar with just 5 months of experience, and he found there was small bile that required resection. And after surgery, the patient was hypotensive, wasn't nursed in critical care, and died of presumably renal failure 20 hours after surgery. This is just one of many similar cases that NCEPOD were reporting at the time. In fact, the NCEPOD reports from the 1990s have a very consistent and familiar theme, asking for more senior involvement, better resuscitation, and better access to critical care for emergency general surgical cases. Despite this, there was very little evidence of any improvement throughout the 1990s and the 2000s. In fact, there was very few studies and certainly no national data being collected. However, one retrospective database found that mortality between 1996 and 2007 remained fairly static at around 15%. Another pair of studies found that mortality for patients aged over 80 had really improved very little over that time period. And this was all in stark contrast to the steadily improving mortality rates for elective and planned surgical care, where year-on-year improvements have been made in elective colorectal work. And it's now widely recognised that elective surgical cases had access to a wide range of perioperative care and staffing that emergency general surgical cases didn't have access to, despite the fact that they were sicker and older. In fact, the Association of Surgeons characterised the emergency service for surgical patients as a Cinderella service, i.e. an inferior second-class service. And fundamentally, there was never the same scrutiny for these patients that might have driven improvements in their care. In 2011, the Royal College of Surgeons also admitted that the problem was a lack of detailed outcome measurements for emergency surgery patients, leaving hospitals unable to implement changes based on feedback. In fact, the tide was already changing with the formation of the Emergency Laparotomy Network in 2010, which was a collaboration using the free NHS Networks service of 200 clinicians from 40 different hospitals, all with an interest in emergency laparotomy. And they published the first prospective multi-centre study in the UK of emergency laparotomy outcomes. And they looked at a 3-month period from 35 different sites, almost 2,000 laparotomies, and they confirmed that the mortality from emergency laparotomy was almost 15%. And there was a very close association with increasing age. The over 80s had almost a 25% mortality, and this is far in excess of the mortality for any of the common elective general surgical cases at the time. Moreover, between the 35 participating sites in the study, there was a large variation in mortality, and that variation couldn't be explained just by differences in case mix. And there was also significant variation in the provision of consultant staff in theatres. Moreover, consultant presence seemed to fall during out-of-hours periods, despite the fact that presumably those were sicker patients. There was also substantial variation in other aspects of care provided, including the provision of critical care. And this large variation in mortality and clinical care led the authors to call for a national audit programme. The value of doing a national audit programme had been well established at the time. In fact, at the time, the Healthcare Quality Improvement Partnership, or HQIP, had invited new applications for national projects, so there was a large expansion of the national audit programme. And despite the stiff competition, NELA was ranked second out of 11 national projects that were prioritised for funding by HWIP. The contract was awarded in 2012 and an organisational audit commenced a year later. The Royal College of Anaesthetists took responsibility for running the project. So what standards did NELA set from the outset? Well, NELA didn't initially create any new standards. These standards had already been published by the Royal College of Surgeons, NCEPOD and others, but NELA did choose 6 key standards from which hospitals would be given a RAG rating. And the first standard would be the documentation of an objective risk assessment of mortality. This is a key step in determining levels of care for all subsequent parts of the emergency laparotomy pathway, and it should be more detailed than simply a crude ASA grading. The second key standard would be consultant input preoperatively. When NELA started, PPOSM was used as the best objective tool to assess perioperative risk, and NELA suggested that high-risk patients, i.e. those with a PPOSM greater than 5%, should get consultant input from anaesthetists and surgeons, and those who were at the highest risk, i.e. greater than 10% risk of death, should get a consultant intensivist input preoperatively as well. The third standard of care would be to have patients arriving to theatre without delay. For example, patients shouldn't breach their NCEPOD categorisation. For example, patients who had septic shock or life-threatening GI bleeding shouldn't take longer than 2 hours to get to theatre once a decision for theatre had been made. And of course, we all know that delays in administering antibiotics is associated with an hour-by-hour increase in sepsis mortality, but also there's very good evidence to suggest delaying patients with sepsis getting to theatre is also associated with a clear increase in hour-by-hour mortality. The fourth standard of care would be that consultant surgeons and anaesthetists should actually be present in theatre for all higher risk cases. The time of day shouldn't prevent the provision of this consultant presence. The fifth standard of care would be that all higher risk cases should be directly admitted to critical care post-operatively. The provision of critical care allows the early recognition and management of complications that are very common in these patients. The sixth standard of care would be that frail and elderly patients should have care of the elderly reviews. These patients have complex medical and social needs that aren't easily dealt with by surgical teams. Frailty is an independent risk factor for mortality in emergency laparotomy. So where have we got to? So as of June 2019, NELA is now halfway through its 6th year of data collection. It has produced 1 organisational report at the start and 4 patient reports. That means data has been collected for almost 130,000 patients from 190 hospitals. So that's a huge amount of data. So what tangible changes have been achieved by all of this hard work? Well, yes, things actually have changed. More patients every year are now having their risk properly assessed and documented preoperatively. And it was recognised that we could do better than the PPOSM scoring system. So having collected data from more than 38,000 patients at the time, the NELA team used that data to develop a new scoring system, the NELA score system, and made it available on both on their web tool and on a smartphone app. And the majority of cases of emergency laparotomies in the United Kingdom are now risk assessed with this objective tool. And year on year, consultant delivered care in theatre is getting better. Nationally, length of stays are getting shorter, meaning that bed days are being saved and a large amount of money is being saved to the NHS. And most importantly, the national 30-day mortality has steadily been dropping every year, so that in the Year 4 report, the national mortality was down to 9.5, which is equivalent to an extra 700 lives saved per year. Moreover, as the largest dataset of emergency laparotomies in the world, NELA has been able to look at longer-term mortality now, linking it with ONS data, and the 1-year mortality from emergency laparotomies is dropping. So it's certain that NELA has had a substantial impact on lives saved, money saved, and better care delivered. So there are many reasons for congratulations. There are also some areas where improvement hasn't been so clear. The ability to get higher risk cases and high risk cases into critical care post-operatively hasn't shown the same dramatic improvement, and it's certainly static for the last 2 to 3 years. Similarly, the ability to get patients into theatre in a timely manner hasn't shown improvement in the same way as well. Ironically, the patients that most often miss their time target are those who are NCEPOD category 1, i.e. those who need to get to theatre the quickest. Additionally, the longest delays seem to be for those patients coming to theatre in the afternoons between the hours of 12 and 5 p.m. Similarly, hospitals have really struggled with the provision of care of the elderly reviews for their elderly patients after laparotomies. It's interesting to note that the areas of improvement that NELA has made are all areas where individual motivated staff members can really make a difference. And the areas where NELA has stagnated have been areas where there are significant financial or organisational or infrastructure barriers that exist to prevent improvement. To tackle these organisational barriers, NELA introduced best practice tariffs from April 2019, and it's a split tariff where if hospitals are able to meet their best practice targets, they will get additional revenue, and those that don't meet their best practice tariff will actually lose money. So it's designed to incentivise care. Achieving the best practice tariff is not by any means guaranteed, even if you think your hospital is doing well. 80% of your high-risk patients, i.e. patients with a risk score greater than 5%, need to have consultant anaesthetist in theatre, consultant surgeon in theatre, and go to critical care post-operatively, and you need to have a sufficient case ascertainment level to convince your commissioners that your data is reflective of what is actually happening in your hospital or in your trust. So NELA is trying to move to a model of continuous improvement of real-time data. There are real-time run chart graphs that can be produced online for your individual hospital, and all of this data can be fed back to clinicians by local staff. And the Emergency Laparotomy Collaborative recently published their results in JAMA showing that implementation of a specific 6-point care bundle over and above NELA can also improve mortality. So to conclude, most of us will look after these patients, and for most of us they will be our sickest and most vulnerable patients. And there's a consensus that there's been a long-standing inequity between elective work and the provision of resources for our emergency laparotomy patients. That's not to say that we're denigrating the perioperative care provided to elective work, but the balance should be readdressed. It's also interesting to note that NELA was developed from relatively humble beginnings, with the Emergency Laparotomy Network using a free NHS networks platform to start the whole project. And NELA is now by far the largest prospective data collection of emergency laparotomy cases, and it's only been possible through multidisciplinary collaboration. NELA has shown us that lives saved early in the post-operative period means extended lives with quality of life for those patients. And best practice tariffs will seek to break some of the barriers to further improvement in the care for these patients. So that's a summary of the background from which NELA was developed, the achievements that have already been made, and the strategies for improving quality of care for our patients. Thanks for watching, and good luck with your local quality improvement.